Hey folks, not to be an alarmist or anything, but there just might be something in your wallet right now that is a matter of life or death. Not for you, but for several strangers. In the United States, for example, your driver's license either does or does not have a tiny little dot on it that says donor. It's small and we spend very little time thinking about it. But we really ought to, because organ transplantation is an underappreciated modern miracle that we are lucky to have in comparison to the billions of humans who previously didn't. So let's take a step back through history and explore how things were in order to get an appreciation for what's possible today, such as the first full human head transplant scheduled to take place next year. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For millions of years, the barriers preventing successful organ transplantation in the human species were numerous and seemingly insurmountable. If one of your major organs stopped functioning, well, so did you. Now the biggest obstacle to fixing whatever breaks is actually the paperwork and the difficulties concerning organ donation. These days, if you ever hear your doctor spout the words major surgery and trial and error in the same sentence, I recommend you get a second opinion. But the internal organs were an impenetrable mystery to the human race for most of our history. They could not examine living organs directly, and even examining non-living bodies was difficult or taboo. Things that we take for granted on medical posters in the classroom today would have been shocking to our ancestors. For example, did you know that the average human spends his entire life within a few meters of a spooky skeleton? Think about it. Okay, now stop thinking about it. But over time, ancient people learned from observing what happened after someone was wounded. Galen, a celebrated ancient doctor, learned things from working with wounded gladiators, such as, hey, we should probably be keeping these intestine things on the inside. He also got some things wrong. He thought that blood was created in the liver and needed regular purging from the body through bloodletting, which is not at all how blood is supposed to work. The brain, too, started off playing a mysterious role. The ancient Egyptians from around 5,000 years ago used a series of syllables to refer to the brain that roughly translates to skull offal, offal being defined as waste material. They originally considered it a sort of gross skull stuffing that functioned as a snot funnel. Hey, what a coincidence! Snot funnel was my band's name in high school. Aha! Why am I like this? But when people who got whacked in the head developed serious problems, they took a closer look. Of course, the ancient Egyptians never gained a full appreciation for the brain, and preferred to remove it during mummification in order to keep the head dry and prevent additional decomposition. They didn't see this as a problem because they believed that the heart contained the important stuff like memory. Ancient Egypt was an interesting time to be alive. Teeth, serving an important and obvious function, were probably the first body part to ever be replaced. Dental work in general has been attempted for at least 15,000 years, but some of the most interesting replacement evidence comes from South America, where indigenous peoples replaced lost teeth with seashells around the years 600 to 800 CE. Amazingly, the bone in the surrounding tooth socket grew in to meet the seashell, creating a successful permanent implant. In France, around the time Les Miserables takes place, dentists began offering the service of taking teeth from one mouth hole belonging to a poor or dead person and transplanting them to a mouth hole of a richer, not dead person. Teeth quickly became goods to be sold. As author David Hamilton notes, scavengers who visited the battlefields of Europe, notably after the Battle of Waterloo, removed teeth from the huge number of dead soldiers. However, there was a catch. Certain infectious diseases, most notably syphilis, could come with the tooth, which would eventually cause the rich recipient's face to fall apart. Ah, the price of vanity. But of course, teeth aren't organs and usually functioned as inert implants. If we want to talk about human transplants, we need to start with the largest organ, the skin. Surprisingly, skin transplantation has a long history, probably beginning in the 6th century BCE or earlier in ancient India. A medical text from that time, called the Sushruta Samhita, describes a form of plastic surgery of the nose, or a rhinoplasty, that required rotating a flap of skin from the cheek or forehead onto the nose while leaving the base attached to keep it supplied by the original blood vessels. Once the graft takes hold, it is severed and sculpted into a new nose. This was used to replace the noses of people who lost them in sword fights, for example. At the time, plastic surgery was a very respectable profession, but eventually the upper tiers of the caste system began to reject it because it both required manual work and the touching of another's body. And so, these highly skilled doctors slowly lost their social status, and while the practice never died out completely, by the time Europeans learned of these methods nearly 2,000 years later, the operations were being performed by artisan surgeons associated with the lowly trades of potter and brickmaker. Knowledge of this ancient method was eventually carried to Italy, where after a period of experimentation by a father-son team called the Broncos, a brilliant surgeon named Tagliacozzi improved the method by allowing a skin flap from the upper arm to be used, resulting in less facial scarring. This meant that patients had to have their arms strapped to their faces for some number of weeks. Strangely enough, that's the same technique used by our drummer during our snot funnel days. Tagliacozzi wrote down and illustrated his revolutionary methods in a book, which was basically ignored for 200 years because the public got confused and spread false rumors about them. For example, people spoke of transplanting a free graft nose from one human to another. The claim was that slaves were having their noses cut off and applied to their masters' faces, but when the slave eventually died, the grafted nose would die too. This did not work and did not happen, as Tagliacozzi made clear in his book, but the rumors destroyed the credibility of the actual procedures. Today, we know that the immune system was responsible for making these person-to-person grafts, called allografts, impossible at the time. There is an interesting exception to this immune system rule involving the cornea, or the thin outside tissue layer of the eye. Because it exists in relative isolation from the bloodstream, where the immune system does most of its work from, a cornea allograft has a high success rate. In fact, in 1837, a surgeon reported a successful corneal transplantation between two gazelles. Unfortunately, this success would not be repeated in humans until 1906. Excluding the cornea, a typical skin allograft from one human to another fails slowly, not immediately. It is rejected after about 1 or 2 weeks under a normal immune system. But surgeons in the 1700s and 1800s had terrible follow-up with their patients, and so after slapping the donor skin on and kicking the patient out the door, they often reported these grafts as successful, when they totally weren't. And in the instance when a patient returned claiming that the graft had failed, the surgeon would sometimes blame the patient for infecting the wound during the changing of the bandages, and definitely not the procedure itself. Then, things took a strange shift in the late 1800s when surgical focus moved from skin to glands. The thyroid, pancreas, adrenal, sex, and other glands involuntarily participated in possibly the most bizarre chapter of early transplantation. Because, with very little regard to actual science, surgeons began implanting slices of these glands under patients' skin. Why? Because it paid very well. For one example, men with problems in the bedroom would pay hefty sums for various monkey glands, including I think you can guess, to be inserted into them. This did not work, but the advertising of this process was successful, with men claiming to have better stamina after the surgery. Surgeons didn't know that the grafted tissue didn't survive because they implanted it so deep that they never checked, and also some of them didn't really care as long as they got paid. Medical ethics was barely a thing at the time. Most famously, the Kansas-based doctor and later politician John Brinkley made around $12 million off of these surgeries in the 1920s and 30s, at least partially while the Great Depression was happening. Later, after barely failing to get elected as the governor of Kansas because of a voting technicality, it was widely revealed that he had bought his diploma and had no actual medical training. As you have undoubtedly gathered at this point, the history of organ transplantation was, at times, utter madness. The scientific and social barriers were so great that it has been only an extremely recent development that organ transplantation has become the relatively routine procedure that it is today. But there is still one more major barrier in the way of saving the lives of the people who die every day from organ failure, and that, simply put, is paperwork. In 2012, a survey released by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services revealed that 95% of respondents were in favor of organ donation, and yet, on the same survey, only 62% of respondents said that they had granted permission to donate their own organs. This disconnect between people believing that donating is a good idea and yet not giving permission to donate their own organs leads to over 8,000 people dying in the United States every year because they can't get an organ donor in time, despite public support for the practice. Many approaches have been, well, approached in order to solve this dilemma. For example, because 80% of the waiting transplant patients in the United States are looking for a kidney, black market kidney practices are on the rise. Follow the link in the description to a Vice documentary on this subject that follows a journalist who decides to try buying a kidney from Bangladesh and discovers a town full of poor people who have sold off one kidney each. Not all recent news is depressing, though. Scientists have been having some recent successes in growing human organs either in the lab or inside of animals, which may someday eliminate the need for human donors altogether. For example, a line of genetically engineered pigs have been developed with corneas that lack specific proteins in them that usually trigger the human immune system, and so they will hopefully work as viable transplants. And of course, advancements in the world of artificial organs, especially hearts, are incredible. A dear friend of mine, Charles Winthrop, describes how his heart is monitored wirelessly from a control center. They can call him up on his cell phone if there is a problem and shock his heart back into rhythm wherever he happens to be.
And they have called me before and said, okay, we need you to lay down on the floor wherever you're at right now. It's happened about twice that I've been in the grocery store and they'll say, okay, what's happening is we have to make an adjustment to stop you from going into cardiac arrest.
Oh, wow.
Because the pacemaker can identify it's coming. If we stop it now, he won't have a heart attack. They warned me when they put it in. They said occasionally when you'll have to have an adjustment made, you'll feel this. It'll feel like a minor electrical shock inside your chest. Make sure no one is touching you when it happens.
And more good news, so many people are in favor of organ donation in the 21st century that some countries have enacted presumed consent policies, where if a person doesn't specify whether or not they want to be an organ donor, they automatically are, but can opt out if they disagree with donating. The United States does not have this policy, although more than half of Americans support it, so that could change. Someday we will have figured out some combination of consent laws and technology that will prevent people from falling through the gaps in the transplantation process. But until then, here is what you can do to help, right now. If you live in the United States, follow the link in the description or click on the screen now to go to the ARTexplains and Step Back History Organ Donation Registry Sign-Up Drive, which is a website we have set up through the Donate Life America nonprofit organization. There, you'll be able to join the National Donate Life Registry. Even if you already have a donor sticker on your driver's license, it is still a good idea to join the National Registry in order to make your intent to donate crystal clear. Thank you so much for watching the director's cut version of Organ Transplantation. The original video is over on the Step Back History channel. While you're here, check out some of the other videos. They are handmade in small batches with love.